Hello?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello?
Is this Mrs. Dorothy Letterman?
That's right, Dorothy.
Yes, it is. Who's this?
Are you the mother of David Letterman who does Late Night on NBC?
She sat across from him dozens of times. She made him laugh. She made millions of Americans laugh alongside him. And then one day, without a phone call, without a conversation, without a single word of explanation, she was simply never invited back. No public confrontation. No heated argument caught on tape. No dramatic moment under the studio lights that anyone could point to and say, "There, that is where it ended." Just silence. And in Hollywood, silence from the right person is not neutral. It is a sentence. Her name was Joan Rivers. And the man who delivered that sentence, quietly, completely, and without appeal, was Johnny Carson. The most powerful figure in American entertainment for 30 consecutive years. But this is not only Joan Rivers' story. Because Rivers was not the first. And she was not the last. Carson's power to simply remove people from the only stage that mattered in that era touched more careers than the public record ever fully captured. And the way he exercised that power tells us something important about what happens when one person holds absolute authority over an entire industry with no accountability structure in place. What really happened behind the curtain of The Tonight Show? Stay with us because the answer is more calculated and more final than most people realize. Stay with us because the full story goes far deeper than a falling out between two comedians, and what it reveals about power and loyalty in Hollywood will change the way you see late-night television entirely. Or understand what Johnny Carson did to Joan Rivers, and to the others before and after her. You first have to understand what Johnny Carson actually was. He was not simply a television host. Between 1962 and 1992, Carson was the final arbiter of who mattered in American entertainment. The Tonight Show was not a talk show in any ordinary sense. It was an institution. A 30-year cultural ritual that drew audiences of 15 to 18 million viewers on a typical weeknight. In an era before social media, before streaming platforms, before any independent path to a national audience existed, The Tonight Show was the mechanism through which careers were either confirmed or quietly ended. Carson himself had an almost mythic quality to him. He was charming without seeming to try. He was funny without overselling it. He possessed the rare ability to make any guest feel like the most interesting person in the room, and the camera loved him in a way it has loved very few people before or since. He had come up through radio, through regional television, through years of careful study of his craft, and by the time he inherited The Tonight Show from Jack Paar in October of 1962, he was prepared for exactly what was waiting. What followed was unlike anything American entertainment had produced before. Carson built a nightly ritual for the country. Millions of Americans went to bed with his monologue playing in the background. He introduced Steve Martin to a national audience. He gave David Letterman his first major platform. He is directly responsible for the careers of comedians, musicians, and actors who walked through his curtain as unknowns and walked out as permanent fixtures of the culture. Jay Leno, Jerry Seinfeld, Ellen DeGeneres, Jim Carrey, Roseanne Barr. All of them received the Carson benediction. A genuine laugh from Johnny meant you had arrived. A return invitation meant you were worth watching. A standing invitation meant you were among the chosen few. But power of that magnitude does not exist without a shadow side. Beneath the warmth and the precision wit, Carson was a man who treated loyalty as something closer to a debt than a feeling. He was famously private, notoriously guarded, deeply uncomfortable with anyone who threatened to diminish or rival what he had built. 3 marriages. A personal life his colleagues consistently described as impenetrable even to those closest to him. A remoteness that served him perfectly on camera and cost him dearly off of it. These were not incidental details about a complicated man. They were the architecture of someone who had learned to control his world with quiet and absolute precision, and who responded to any perceived breach of that control not with anger, but with erasure. The warning signs of Carson's willingness to blacklist were visible years before Joan Rivers became the most famous example. Wayne Newton had performed on The Tonight Show reliably for years. He was popular with audiences, consistent in his delivery, and entirely uncontroversial by any reasonable measure. Then came a reported dispute involving a tabloid story and a perception, accurate or not, that Newton had stepped outside a boundary Carson had never formally stated but nonetheless fully expected to be observed. Newton was gone. No announcement accompanied his removal. No explanation was offered. The invitations simply stopped arriving. Rich Little was one of the most celebrated impressionists of his generation. His Carson impression was sharp and, by most accounts, warmly received by Carson himself in private settings. But somewhere in the gap between performing an impression of the most powerful man in late-night television and that man continuing to control the only stage that mattered, a line was crossed that neither party ever discussed publicly. Little found himself on the outside looking in. The pattern that emerges from these early cases is consistent and, on reflection, deeply deliberate. Carson held no press conferences. He issued no public statements. He filed no complaints with anyone. He simply withdrew access. And in an era where his platform was the entire game, withdrawal of access was functionally indistinguishable from a career death sentence. What made the system so effective, and so difficult to challenge, was its invisibility. There was no blacklist anyone could point to. There was no documented policy to protest. There was only the absence of a phone call, repeated indefinitely, until the message became impossible to misread. But even with those casualties visible in the background, nobody, not agents, not managers, not the performers themselves, seemed to fully calculate the risk until Joan Rivers triggered the most total and publicized version of it. Hold on to the pattern you have just watched take shape, because what Joan Rivers did next, and the precision of Carson's response, is not simply the most famous example of that pattern. It is the clearest and most complete window into what unaccountable power looks like when it is exercised by someone who genuinely believes he has earned the right to use it. Joan Rivers did not arrive at The Tonight Show as a stranger. Carson found her. In 1965, he watched her perform stand-up and told her, live and on camera to millions of viewers, that she was going to be a star. That sentence, delivered in front of the country, was not a small gesture. It was a consecration. It changed the trajectory of her life in ways that neither of them could have fully anticipated at the time. She became a regular guest. She was invited back repeatedly over the following years. She became, in the language of the industry, Carson's protégé, the comedian he had personally elevated and whose national profile was inseparable from his endorsement. For nearly 2 decades, that relationship held. Rivers was sharp, fearless, and constitutionally incapable of pulling her punches. Carson appreciated that quality visibly. He laughed at her material in a way that read as genuine to any audience watching. Their chemistry was real. The professional affection between them appeared to be real. But in 1986, Joan Rivers made a decision that Carson would never forgive. Fox Broadcasting, a fledgling network that most industry insiders were not yet taking seriously, approached her with an offer to host her own late-night program. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers would air in direct competition with The Tonight Show. Rivers was not simply changing channels. She was going head-to-head against the man who had made her, on a platform built specifically to challenge his. There was, by nearly every account of the period, one critical failure in how the transition was handled. Rivers did not call Carson before the deal was announced. She did not pick up the phone and tell him personally what she was about to do before it appeared in the trades. Whether that omission was a management miscommunication, a deliberate avoidance of a conversation she knew would be difficult, or simply a chaotic oversight in a fast-moving negotiation, the result was identical. Carson learned about her new show through the press. And that, in Carson's personal code of conduct, was the unforgivable act. Not the competition. Not the departure. The fact that he had not been told first. The show itself collapsed within a year. Fox canceled The Late Show starring Joan Rivers after less than 12 months on air. Rivers was fired from her own program. Her husband and manager Edgar Rosenberg, shattered by the failure, died by suicide 3 months after the cancellation. In a span of less than a year, Rivers had lost the network deal, lost her show, and lost her husband. Carson did not call. Not when the show was canceled. Not when Edgar died. Not in the months or years that followed. Not once. Rivers spoke about it openly, and repeatedly, in the decades before her own death in September of 2014. She said she had reached out and been refused. She said she never arrived at a complete understanding of why the punishment had been so total, why the man who had told a young comedian she was going to be a star could become someone who behaved, without any apparent difficulty, as though the comedian had never existed. The answer becomes less mysterious when you accept what Carson believed the relationship had always been. He had not simply supported Joan Rivers. In his own understanding of events, he had created her. And when she competed against him without warning, she had not merely made a business decision. She had taken something that, in his accounting, belonged to him. The Joan Rivers story was not an emotional overreaction by an unusually private man. It was the most visible and documented expression of a system Carson had been operating for the full span of his tenure, and there are at least 3 structural conditions that allowed that system to persist, unchallenged, for 30 years. The first is the pure concentration of authority that Carson's position represented. In the 1960s, 1970s, and through most of the 1980s, late-night television was not a competitive marketplace. It was a monopoly with a single gatekeeper. That concentration meant that the booking preferences of one person, one man's private sense of who deserved access, carried the weight of an industry verdict. There was no competing platform of equal standing to absorb the talent he declined to promote. When Carson closed a door, there was no equivalent door to open elsewhere. The second structural condition is the debt culture his platform created. Every performer who appeared on The Tonight Show owed something enormous to that appearance, and they knew it. The gratitude was real, and it was professionally significant. That culture of indebtedness made it nearly impossible for anyone within the system to speak critically about Carson while he remained powerful. To challenge the man was to risk losing the platform, and losing the platform in that era was a risk almost no career could afford to absorb. The third condition is the one that made the entire system legally bulletproof. Because Carson never announced a blacklist, there was nothing to challenge. He was under no obligation to explain his booking decisions to anyone. His silence was not a violation of any policy or law. It was simply a choice, repeated, deliberate, and invisible, that produced consequences as severe as any public condemnation, without any of the accountability that public condemnation might have triggered. Dana Carvey navigated a version of this dynamic after his Saturday Night Live impression of Carson circulated widely. Howie Mandel managed his relationship with The Tonight Show carefully enough to protect it. Others were less fortunate or less careful. The list of performers who appeared on The Tonight Show for the last time without understanding it was the last time is almost certainly longer than any public accounting has captured. What connects all of them is the mechanism. Not confrontation. Not argument. Not public statements. Just the withdrawal of access, and the understanding for anyone paying close enough attention that the withdrawal was permanent. But the most revealing part of this story is not what Carson did to the careers around him. It is what his final years tell us about the cost of building an entire world on the premise that control and connection are the same thing, and what happens when that world is finally, inevitably gone. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show on May 22, 1992. The final broadcast drew an estimated 50 million viewers. It remains one of the most watched television events in American broadcast history. He sat at his desk for the last time, spoke to his audience in a register that was quieter and more unguarded than his usual presentation, and said goodbye. There was no guest. It was just Carson and the camera, which, in retrospect, felt entirely true to who he had always been. What followed was as deliberate as everything else he had ever done. Carson did not transition into a new public chapter. He did not accept speaking engagements or write a memoir or allow himself to be the subject of a retrospective interview. He simply disappeared. He moved to Malibu. He declined press requests consistently and without exception. He declined